IL-12 receptor deficiency is an immunodeficiency disorder caused by defective IL-12 receptors on naive helper T cells. As a result, these cells cannot be induced to become Th1 type effector cells. Overall, this impairs host defense against intracellular pathogens. In this video, I'll share my visual way to remember the key facts about IL-12R deficiency. An earthquake has devastated the town, and all first responders have been called into the city center. Right away, take a look at this collapsed clock tower. Notice that this clock has two adjacent or interlocking faces, and these interlocking faces are both pointing at 12 o'clock. Since interlocking objects are our recurring symbol for the interleukins, the interlocking faces pointing to 12 represents interleukin 12, or IL-12. In some ways, this clock tower is a receptor for the clock faces, right? And since this clock tower is broken, this picture reminds me of IL-12 receptor deficiency. IL-12 receptor deficiency is exactly what it sounds like, a disorder characterized by defective receptors for IL-12. This means that IL-12 cannot signal appropriately. We cover how IL-12 works in a dedicated video on that cytokine. But in brief, IL-12 induces naive helper T cells to become active helper T cells of the Th1 subtype. Let's see what else is happening around this broken clock tower to learn more about the disease. As I mentioned before, I'm part of the First Help team here. Yeah, in this city, they call all first responders first helpers, since we are first onto the scene to help, and we administer first aid or first help, right? Recall that first helper is actually our recurring symbol for helper T cell type 1, or Th1, a subtype of helper T cell. Get it? Helper for helper T cells, and the first bit reminds us that we are talking about Th1 cells, or the first type of helper T cells. So first helper for Th1 cells. Next, notice how we first helpers have been blocked from entering the building by this collapsed doorway. The blocked first helper is our symbol for decreased Th1 production. Get it? Because the first helper response has been blocked. In IL-12 receptor deficiency, there is a decreased Th1 cell response. Recall that IL-12 signaling is responsible for inducing naive helper T cells to turn into Th1 cells. So, if IL-12 receptors are defective, this signaling cannot happen, and the helper T cells do not turn into Th1. Just remember that the first helper team is having trouble entering the clock tower. Command dispatch, come in. Can you hear me? Whatever. These walkie-talkies suck. I probably shouldn't have thrown this walkie-talkie. It's just so frustrating that every time you need to transmit something, you get all this interference. Notice how even that screen is all garbled up with interference. By the way, the interference here should remind you of the interferons, since interference sounds like interferon. And notice how this walkie-talkie has buttons that make it look like a game machine, almost like a Game Boy or something. Anyway, the game-like controls here should remind you of the Greek letter gamma, or gamma. Get it? Putting this together, this interference in a game-like transmitter should remind you of the cytokine interferon gamma, or IFN gamma. Finally, I've thrown this walkie-talkie onto the ground, so it is low on the ground. This represents how interferon gamma levels are decreased in IL-12 receptor deficiency. If you've seen our videos on Th1 cells or interferon gamma, you would know that interferon gamma is produced by Th1 cells. We've already talked about how Th1 production is impaired in this disorder. So if we knock out the cells producing IFN gamma, you can imagine how interferon gamma levels themselves would also be decreased. Interferon gamma is a cytokine important in activating macrophages, and it is this dual Th1 cell and macrophage response that is impaired in IL-12 receptor deficiency. This greatly impairs our immune system's ability to fight infections by intracellular organisms, which we'll touch on later. Oh look, there's a survivor there. Get in there, team. Check out that old survivor who is making his way out of the building. Notice that he is using a cane to help him walk. Maybe it's because this guy is old or because he has been injured in this collapse. In any case, This cane also happens to be our symbol for immunodeficiency, since immunodeficiency means a weakened immune system, and a cane is used when someone is too weak to walk, right? This cane helps us remember that IL-12 receptor deficiency is an immunodeficiency. This makes sense given the decreased Th1 response and interferon gamma production. Since Th1 and the macrophage response to interferon gamma are critical to an effective immune response against intracellular pathogens, these patients develop recurring infections due to these organisms. To symbolize this fact, take a look at the kennel in the old man's hand. You know how in times of danger, the first thing that people save are their pets. You might even say that this old man is partial or susceptible to whatever pet is inside that kennel. This pet inside the kennel is our symbol for intracellular organisms. Again, IL-12 receptor deficiency is characterized by susceptibility to intracellular organisms. This happens because of impaired Th1 cell production and reduced macrophage activation, which is dependent on IFN gamma signaling. Th1 cells coordinate many types of cells, including cytotoxic T cells, NK cells, and macrophages to fight these intracellular infections, while macrophages are like soldiers on the ground that do the actual work of phagocytosis and antigen presentation. In IL-12 receptor deficiency, both of these are impaired. As a result, intracellular organisms like TB or Salmonella cause severe infection in these patients. One way exam writers like to get you is by giving you a patient who develops systemic symptoms after receiving a BCG vaccine. Basically, BCG is a live attenuated vaccine for TB, meaning that it contains a strain of TB that has been weakened. This weakened TB is usually overwhelmed by our immune system, but in patients with IL-12 receptor deficiency, this weakened BCG actually causes infection because our immune system can't kill the organisms, right? Let's move on. Okay, finally, take a look at my paramedic's cart. Yep, this is a small stretcher with wheels, and it's the reason why we can't fit into this doorway. Here at Pixarize, we use small carts to symbolize autosomal recessive inheritance, since small could stand for recessive, and carts have 4 wheels, kind of like an automobile, right? Autosomal, automobile, get it? IL-12 receptor deficiency is inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern. To be frank, I would not remember this for test day. Autosomal recessive inheritance is the lowest yield of the inheritance patterns, because it tells you nothing other than the fact that the disease is rare. But we included it here for completeness for all you gunners out there. Alright, that's it for IL-12 receptor deficiency. Let's recap quickly so we can get back to work. IL-12 receptor deficiency is an autosomal recessive immunodeficiency disorder characterized by defective IL-12 receptors. Since IL-12 signaling is essential for naive helper T cells to differentiate into Th1 cells, there is a decreased Th1 response in these patients. Decreased Th1 response reduces interferon gamma signaling to activate macrophages. Decreased Th1 response also impairs downstream killer T cell and NK cell responses against intracellular pathogens. Ultimately, patients with IL-12 receptor deficiency are susceptible to infections by intracellular organisms like mycobacteria and Salmonella. And now we're actually done with IL-12R deficiency. See you in the next one.